Climate change or climate control, understanding planetary conditions under man. While the earth is enslaved, none of us is free. While the earth is a nigger, so are we. Alice Walker, everything is a human being. My turn to state an equation. Colonization equals thingification. Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism. This piece looks at the issue of climate control versus climate change in the hood. There's separation in our communities around what exactly has caused the rampant, more severe, more frequent superstorms, earthquakes, monsoons, and wildfires we are witnessing across the planet. Some people embrace the idea of climate change, which typically states that levels of wasteful overconsumption by everyday people has caused a destabilizing level of environmental alteration that the planet has never seen. On the flip side, many embrace the concept of climate control, in which it's not average population members and their participation in the day-to-day economy ravaging the ecosystem, but rather the people at the upper echelons of society who cause modern catastrophes for their profit. Importantly, the climate control line argues that a literal machine or piece of technology is being used to significantly alter mostly weather patterns, while the climate change line argues that our species' cumulative addition to pollution is a logical outgrowth of natural mechanisms in our genetic makeup. Both sides see the other as conspiratorial. Climate change theory makes sense according to a mainstream liberal logic. It's often focused on getting political leaders and scientists to push government's regulatory action around this issue. It's particularly appealing to a huge number of black people who have experienced or been organizing around environmental justices like the well-known travesty of water quality issues in Flint, Michigan, and who seek state restitution for damages. Climate control theory, though, makes more sense according to an anti-establishment logic, as it often focuses on inspiring regular people to expose the rulers of society and push some degree of either intellectual autonomy from the mainstream or a practical opposition to the establishment. It's especially appealing to a huge number of black people who have lived through environmental injustices as well, but who would never trust scientists because of brutal histories of mistreatment, like the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and who also don't necessarily find any resolution in the government either for the same reasons. Both sides of this debate in our communities regard the other position as tied up in white supremacist propaganda. The mainstream liberal line identifies climate control theory with right-wing conservative agendas, and the anti-establishment line identifies climate change theory with left-wing postmodern agendas. Both of these poles share one thing in common: a somewhat critical, conscientious orientation, the underlying force in the black spirit, which pushes us to be concerned about the racial class connections between the struggles of our people and the fate of our planet. Both climate change perspective and climate control perspectives in the hood make us somewhat aware that the climate problem itself, whichever way you frame it, has something to do with racism. Yet, they both fail to fully express that critical conscience in its most logical and ethical form due to a few key analytical gaps. These gaps can only be filled by a radical stance. So this piece seeks to articulate that third revolutionary perspective by first reviewing climate change theory and climate control theory right beside each other, revealing how they are ultimately both wrong, before finally describing a different eco-politics, one that can effectively and accurately confront the stamp of racism upon our planet's current climatic conditions. Climate change Climate change theory is often tied to discussions about an Anthropocene or anthropogenic environmental impact. Both of these words are based on the Greek word anthropos, which means human. They basically describe how the human species has had a unique, unrivaled impact on nature, climate, ecosystems, biodiversity, available natural resources, etc., when compared to other species or other forces. Scientists seeking to understand this unique role humans have played in altering the planet try to measure and trace a combination of economic and biophysical factors, such as consumption, which is the use of resources, pollution, which is the introduction of waste or contamination, deforestation, which is the removal of forests, and which could also include the removal of other habitats, and reproduction, which is additions to the population through the creation of offspring, kids. They identify that there are discernible shifts in the usual flow of things about our natural world, shifts that are markedly distinct from how ecological conditions have unfolded in history before, such as how parts of the ocean are becoming dead zones, ice in the Arctic is melting, carbon levels are getting up there, creating temperatures that are unusually too high and way too consistently high. Massive flooding of coasts is on the way as sea levels start to close in. Plant and non-human animal species are dying off or being seriously endangered at alarming rates. While the planet has surely undergone extreme, inhospitable conditions in the past, it's the rate at which these patterns are currently happening within a given time frame compared to how old the planet is in general, that's causing concern for many and has motivated people to look back across human history to see if our species is the unique factor that has brought us here. What happens next, though, is many scientists and environmentalists take their analysis of human history and flatten all of its complexity into one narrative to say that it's simply human nature to overexploit resources, as if our species is biologically doomed to destabilize the Earth system. From there, we find that a lot of climate change talk becomes focused on policy and laws being passed so that they can regulate the economic affairs that supposedly arise from the supposedly unsustainable and competitive nature of humanity. But what's fishy is it's the economic participation of struggling workers, of everyday people, of poor people that face the brunt of all these regulations, despite the fact that we are exploited people, disproportionately closed out of access to resources. How can those who have the least be the main ones held responsible for ecological wastefulness and blamed for climate change? The people who do not own the oil companies leaving huge spills in our oceans and waterways are being asked to stop driving to work at least twice a week, to walk instead in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as if our participation in the economy is the main source or the main anchor of pollution. It all starts to sound even more fishy when you think about the fact that almost all the historical moments which environmentalists and scientists continue to point to as evidence that humans are naturally predisposed toward unsustainable habits actually correlate to European social formations. So at this point, working class black people are gonna rightfully be skeptical of this entire story about changing planetary conditions, about the economy, and about scientific studies of the humanity, and instead turn toward climate control theory. Especially since climate change talk is often mixed in with phrases like the tragedy of the commons and survival of the fittest and overpopulation that are linked to eugenicist histories. This is happening alongside a larger history of racist practices within white environmental movements, conservation organizations, and wildlife preserves that criminalize indigenous people like the Baka people of Cameroon on their own lands, Central Park being formed in the name of green sensibilities, but upon the backs and the displacement of entire black community. Media hype around poaching in Africa that scapegoats the continent as politically incompetent and socially backward in comparison to the West to justify anti-indigeneity. Climate control theory at least allows one to regard the rich and white people and their governments as adversaries. From a climate control standpoint, you can identify that rich white people are the ones behind all the ecological calamity and that they're just blaming it on poor people's natural habits to advance a plot for world domination under the guise of sustainability regulations. This is a valid conclusion. It represents a somewhat more politically conscious disposition toward the world. It identifies the powerful as arbiters of these catastrophes and resonates strongly with those who know something about how ecological devastations often impact working class black communities much harder and more frequently than white affluent ones. It makes even more sense when you consider how many hurricanes and earthquakes and droughts have hit the global south as opposed to the global north. It's not hard to presume that the change in weather patterns is actually a purposeful assault on the darker and poor peoples of the world when you consider that after such climate devastation occurs, companies and the like will scramble for impacted zones to make a profit. A very well-known example is development projects in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and there are several other horrifying examples. Then you find out that a lot of talks about greenhouse gases has something to do with some scientists trying to develop something known as geoengineering. And then you discover that the U.S. military actually spent a huge top secret operation when fighting in Vietnam, trying to produce rain clouds and influence the monsoon season. It becomes easy to put all the pieces together and say to oneself that the people who have taken a hold of our homelands and continue to start wars to steal the planet's resources have also mastered the earth enough to weaponize its processes against us for their gain. What happens next, though, is that climate control theorists then take the complexities of this more conscious perspective and flatten it into one narrative, namely that Satan apparently runs an elite circle of human beings, the Illuminati, composed apparently of Jews or queer people or communists, who possess some kind of secret machine or technology they use to manipulate the world's affairs in order to maintain their economic power and keep everyone else poor. From there, we find that a lot of climate control talk focuses on populist appeals to the common man that oppose any and all ideas people on social movements which are seen as operating in service of the satanic plot are pushing. But much of this conscious opposition, as they call it, is directed at fellow marginalized and underclass black people. Despite the fact that Jewish people, queer people, communists cannot actually be conflated with white supremacy because black Jews, black queers, black communists exist. Someone's religion or sexuality or ideology cannot be framed as inherently invested in forces of domination and blamed for planetary devastation, especially not when the people being scapegoated in this way are exploited people too. Oftentimes on the front lines fighting against both fascist and imperial violence, including as a way to resolve the same environmental catastrophes that climate control theorists have rightly identified as being caused by white supremacy. Further, the notion of an Illuminati is false and was put out there by rich white colonizers, who needed to invent scapegoats to hide their deeds while exploited peoples continue fighting amongst each other erroneously. So it's a contradiction for anyone who bases their perspective on the climate and how oppositional they need to be to the man and his lies, if we then would try to use white supremacist logic to our advantage. It should be clear that there are serious both logical and ethical problems with both climate change and climate control theory. They place undue focus either on the nature of poor people and their individual choices at the bottom of the structure of society, liberal climate change talk, or on the secret machinery of queer people, Jews, communists, and their individual choices at the top of the structure of society. Conservative climate control talk. And they do this because they serve to hide the fact that the structure of society itself is the source of all these problems. So they create fictional enemies out of those being exploited in this hierarchical structure as a whole, focusing on either the top or the bottom, because both liberal climate change and conservative climate control theory are not interested in abolishing the whole structure. So those pushing climate change and climate control theory are actually just invested in reforming and reclaiming and redefining the structure of society in some way, whether that's through liberal petitions for state redress or policy change, or through right-wing populism that seeks to snatch the reins over the state and capitalism into the common people's hands, and which is a doorway to fascists. An alternative lens is needed, motivated by a revolutionary commitment to abolish the entire structure of the world system by radically resolving the contradictions of the state and capitalism. This perspective theorizes modern environmental crisis not as a problem of climate change or climate control, but rather as a problem of the color line. Color line theory seeks to accurately and conscientiously explain what and who reinforces and benefits from changing ecological conditions by focusing on the structure of society as a whole rather than just what supposedly happens at the top or bottom of the structure. Because of this wider, more holistic analysis, color line theory, when applied to the climate problem, does not push false and illogical and biological reductionist and anti-poor, anti-queer, anti-Semitic, anti-communist misrepresentations of what's going on at the bottom or the top of the structure, which ultimately blame exploited people for the present ecological crisis. Because instead, color line theory understands the hierarchical arrangement that is the modern world system itself, and understands its history, how it exists, how it impacts the planet and our people, how it imposes particular material interests on us in terms of man versus thingified, colonizer versus colonized. A colonizer describes one who imposes a system of land occupation and theft, labor exploitation, and or resource dependency that is to blame for much of our modern concepts of racialization. Colonization is an act of dominance in which a forceful state overtakes a weaker state. This means that colonization is the act of forcefully stripping sovereignty of a country through acquisition of land, resources, raw material, and governmental structures. Systems of colonialism are based in notions of racial inferiority as they perpetuate white European domination over non-white colonial subjects. The most obvious and broad example of colonialism is the expansion of Europe into Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the subsequent creation of colonies. Through violence and manipulation, a relationship of control and influence was exerted economically, socially, politically, religiously, and culturally. This is according to Devin Springer's Understanding Colonialism article. Now, the form of control that is enacted by colonizers is a capitalist one. Under capitalism, open access, free access to natural resources is foreclosed or blocked. Instead, is mediated by racialized or colonial class rule. It's a hierarchical arrangement, and it makes our activity in the environment and our relationships to one another and other beings and nature as defined now and subject to the logic of one ruling class and their rights to property. Their property is secured by a state or government apparatus and their armed forces, including police. Under the hand of the state, a small subset of people exercise material ownership over the natural resources of the planet and determine who has access. The rest of us are placed in a position where we are forced into providing labor. There was no other option allowed by the ruling class and their government protections. There's no other way to get direct access to material needs without coming under the fire of the state and their armed forces, who are there to hold down the resources for the most powerful. The purpose of this rigged setup and the theft coercion of our labor is to make every relationship in our society about producing and selling commodities on the market. This market allows for the constant accumulation of resources. This process seeks to commodify everything from land to water to food and even air. Capitalist thought tends to portray this market based in growth and gain seeking as good for the collective and as the best economic system our species has to offer, but its basis and starting place is in an alienation of the masses from the material means of survival, the earthly source of our power, and in the end, it only truly benefits the few. You can read more about that in Anarchata, a Statement. Put together, an analysis of capitalism and colonialism helps us affirm that the primary means by which the planet gets transformed for the man's gain is through a violent mode of production, one that imposes a rift between working class black people and the earthly source of our empowerment. Climate catastrophe is therefore upheld by a global social structure, once again, of what Aimé Césaire called thingification, colonization. So because of this analysis on capitalism and colonialism, black radical traditions will therefore reject both climate change talks and climate control talks. We reject climate change talks, which blame every environmental issue on consumerism that arises from supposedly innate human greed. Black radical ecology will instead point out how 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions is caused by only 100 companies. Black radical traditions will point out how the U.S. military is the world's single most polluting institution. Black radical ecologies will point out how the state fails to address climate catastrophe and ecocide. The state often greenlights and partners with capitalists for profit. Black radical traditions will point out how, since capitalism is about reducing the natural to a constant pursuit of profits, it will always extend and expand ecocidal devastation. It can never actually be sustainable. And black radical traditions will emphasize the fact that since capitalism relies on inequality, it allows overuse of resources for some and exorbitant amounts of waste even in the production process for some, especially the vampiric first world, while others, especially the third world, are shut out of access to even the most basic resources and forced to live with the pollution and toxins that the privileged and powerful irresponsibly and violently discard. Environmental catastrophes always have more to do with the technological and political, economic, social machinery of capital than with the population numbers or consumption levels and consumption habits of working class black people. Period. Understanding this, in the same vein, black radical traditions reject climate control talks again, especially since these highlight the use of machinery by a satanic group. And instead, black radical traditions point out the fact that when it comes to things like white scientists trying to perform geoengineering or cloud seeding, all of it goes back to colonialism and capitalism. For example, with the secret military operation by the U.S. during the Vietnam War I mentioned earlier, called Operation Popeye, the archives show that the U.S. was simply speculating on or stating its intentions to harness already apparent or already pending weather patterns to their tactical advantage, and not that they are actual arbiters or source of such patterns. And it's because their whole motivation and the basis for any of their attempts or discussions or speculations on weather manipulation have continued to be hopes for their success in their militaristic, their capitalist, and their material imperial pursuits. This is important to understand because it affirms for us that they are not as powerful or capable of controlling the planet as they say they are, and that they are simply in the speculative or experimental processes of trying to get closer and closer to mastery for their colonial aims. Our people and our planet are therefore in no way completely held under or doomed to the man's rule, whether that rule is supposedly secured through a satanic technology or supposedly arising from an innate human nature. And this is because it is a system of exploitation that makes up the machine used to alter the planet, as climate control theorists like to call it. And it is, again, a system of exploitation that comprises the anthropogenic environmental impact, as the climate change theorist likes to call it. It's through, again, capitalism and colonialism that natural qualities, such as our capacity for labor, our bodies, our lands, are stolen and reduced to mere things, objects, to produce wealth for the colonizer. When we understand this, we understand that white power in modern ecogenic crisis is maintained and operationalized by way of the color line. So we know that ecocidal machinery, ecocidal anthropocenes can be stopped and broken down, since their major components are simply white authority over our bodies, lands, resources, etc. This authority can therefore be resisted and destroyed through anti-colonial and anti-capitalist movements, which allow human and natural resources to return to and become anew within the earth, no longer being used for a violent mode of production rooted in unchecked growth and greed. The emphasis and distinct value of these positions of black radical ecology, as compared to the two mainstream responses to the modern climate crisis, be that climate control or climate change theory, is that for black radical ecology, both the societal structure of exploitation and ecological catastrophe together can be put to an end, because they are not caused by some universal human nature or a hidden technology controlled by Satan, beyond our apprehension, beyond our reach, beyond anything we can change. No, we can apprehend the problem and we can change it for sure, because its sources are sociogenically instituted. They are lived and embodied through our literal class exploitation, our struggle, and the theft and control of our labor, land, resources, cultures, bodies, etc. This enables us to know we can bind up the man and we can burn down Master's house, because we can reclaim those things, our people and our planet, which colonialism and capitalism have either stolen, have taken a hold of, have tried to take captive, or are seeking to take captive. Suggested readings: The Principles of Environmental Justice, Ecocide and Genocide Are the Secret of Capitalist Efficiency, Words Mean Things, Understanding Colonialism, Land, Bread, Water, Decolonization as Material Struggle, The Future of Science is Black, Burning Down Master's House, Notes Toward a Black Radical Ecology, Go Back and Fetch It, Black Radical Ecology and the African-Centered Paradigm, Whose Man is This? Black Radical Ecology and the Anthropogenic Question, How to Overthrow the Illuminati, Making It Rain, The Science of Weather Manipulation, Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Earth in 2025, When Did Humans Doom the Earth for Good, and The Uninhabitable Earth. All of these articles and this entire read can be found on the hoodcommunistblog.org.